In the autumn of 1942, the world stood balanced between exhaustion and escalation. 3 years into the Second World War, Europe was largely under Axis domination. Nazi Germany controlled vast stretches of the continent, from the Atlantic coast to deep inside the Soviet Union. Italy clung to its colonial ambitions in North Africa. Britain, battered but unbroken after the Blitz, fought desperately across multiple fronts. And the United States, though officially at war since the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, had not yet committed major ground forces to the European mainland. The question confronting Allied planners was simple in theory, but daunting in execution. Where should America first strike Hitler as empire in Europe? The answer would become Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa in November 1942. It marked the first large-scale American ground combat operation against German forces in the European theater. Though overshadowed in public memory by later campaigns such as D-Day, Operation Torch was the moment America truly entered the European battlefield. The strategic debate throughout 1942, Allied leaders wrestled with competing strategies. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin demanded an immediate second front in Western Europe to relieve pressure on the Red Army, which was bleeding heavily under German assault. Many American commanders favored a direct cross-channel invasion into France as soon as possible. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, however, urged caution. Britain had survived 1940 only narrowly. A premature invasion of France could end in disaster. Instead, Churchill advocated striking at what he called the soft underbelly of the Axis, North Africa and the Mediterranean. North Africa mattered for several reasons. Control of the region meant control of the Mediterranean sea lanes, vital for shipping and oil transport. German and Italian forces under General Erwin Rommel threatened British positions in Egypt and the Suez Canal. If the Axis captured the canal, it could sever Britain's lifeline to India and the Far East. American planners were initially skeptical. They feared that a North African campaign would delay the decisive blow against Germany. But by mid-1942, logistical realities made an immediate invasion of France impossible. The United States was still building its army, transporting equipment, and learning how to coordinate massive amphibious operations. North Africa offered a compromise, a chance for American troops to gain combat experience while engaging German forces indirectly. It would also allow the Allies to clear Axis forces from the southern Mediterranean, opening the way for future operations in Italy. President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved the plan. The code name would be Torch, symbolizing the lighting of a new front against tyranny. Planning the invasion Operation Torch required unprecedented coordination between British and American forces. It was the first major Allied amphibious assault of the war. The logistical challenges were staggering. Transporting tens of thousands of troops across the Atlantic, assembling naval escorts, securing landing craft, coordinating air cover, and managing intelligence about enemy defenses. 3 primary landing zones were selected along the North African coast: Casablanca in Morocco, Oran in Algeria, and Algiers in Algeria. These territories were controlled not by Germany directly, but by Vichy France, the collaborationist French regime that governed parts of France and its overseas colonies after the 1940 armistice with Germany. This created a delicate political dilemma. Would French forces resist the Allied landings? Or could they be persuaded to switch sides? American diplomats and intelligence officers worked secretly to contact sympathetic French officers. The Allies hoped that minimal bloodshed would accompany the landings, yet uncertainty loomed. If Vichy troops fought fiercely, the invasion could bog down before it began. The operation was assigned to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would command Allied forces in North Africa. Though relatively unknown to the public at the time, Eisenhower demonstrated a remarkable ability to balance coalition politics and military logistics, skills that would later propel him to even greater command. Naval forces under Admiral Andrew Cunningham and American Admiral Henry Kent Hewitt prepared the massive fleet. Hundreds of ships would carry approximately 100,000 troops. It was an immense undertaking, and one that required absolute secrecy. The landings begin before dawn on November 8, 1942. Allied forces approached the North African coastline. The sea was tense and silent, except for the churn of engines and the slap of waves against hulls. Young American soldiers, many experiencing combat for the first time, prepared to disembark into uncertainty. At Casablanca, American troops under General George S. Patton faced sporadic resistance from French defenders. Naval gunfire erupted as coastal batteries opened fire. Though fighting occurred, it was limited compared to what planners had feared. Within days, Casablanca was secured. At Oran, landings were more chaotic. Unexpected French resistance led to firefights and confusion. Allied ships came under attack, and coordination faltered in places. Yet persistence prevailed. After several days of clashes, Oran too fell under Allied control. Algiers witnessed perhaps the most dramatic political shift. French resistance there was relatively short-lived. Within days, a ceasefire was negotiated with local French authorities, who agreed to cooperate with the Allies. The initial phase of Operation Torch had succeeded, but the campaign was far from over. German response Hitler reacted swiftly to the Allied landings. German forces moved to occupy the previously unoccupied zone of Vichy France, eliminating any pretense of French neutrality. Meanwhile, Axis reinforcements were rushed into Tunisia, the easternmost part of North Africa. The conflict that followed would test American forces in ways they had not anticipated. Though Operation Torch achieved strategic surprise, it also exposed weaknesses in the U.S. Army. Many American units lacked combat experience. Coordination between infantry, armor, and air support was inconsistent. Communications faltered under pressure. These shortcomings would become painfully evident in the months ahead. Yet Torch marked a psychological turning point. American soldiers were now fighting German troops on land in the European theater. The United States had crossed a threshold from industrial supporter to active battlefield participant. For Britain, the success offered relief and renewed momentum. For the Axis, it signaled that the war's balance was beginning to shift. Operation Torch was not merely an invasion. It was a proving ground. It forced American commanders to adapt quickly, to learn under fire, and to confront the realities of modern mechanized warfare. The campaign in North Africa would continue into 1943, culminating in the eventual defeat of Axis forces on the continent. But in those first November days of 1942, the torch had indeed been lit. America had entered the European battlefield, and there would be no turning back. The early success of Operation Torch masked a harder truth. The North African campaign was only beginning. Securing coastal cities was one challenge. Defeating experienced German and Italian forces in the interior was another entirely. As Allied troops pushed eastward from Morocco and Algeria toward Tunisia, they entered a race against time. Axis reinforcements were pouring into Tunis and Bizerte by air and sea, determined to prevent a complete Allied takeover of North Africa. The geography of Tunisia favored the defenders. Rugged mountains, narrow passes, and limited road networks created natural choke points. German commanders, including the formidable General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, quickly fortified key positions. Meanwhile, the legendary Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, retreating westward from Libya after setbacks against the British Eighth Army, prepared to link forces with German units in Tunisia. For the first time in the European theater, American troops would confront seasoned German formations head-on. The learning curve of war American forces advancing into Tunisia in late 1942 and early 1943 were courageous but inexperienced. Many soldiers had trained extensively in the United States, but had never faced combat. Their officers, too, were adjusting to the realities of large-scale mechanized warfare. Logistical coordination proved difficult. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back to Atlantic ports. Equipment sometimes arrived late or in incomplete quantities. Communication between American and British units was occasionally strained by differences in doctrine and command style. German forces exploited these weaknesses. They struck with speed and precision, using combined arms tactics refined in earlier campaigns across Europe. Tanks, artillery, and infantry moved in coordinated thrusts, supported by effective air power. The most sobering moment for the U.S. Army came in February 1943 at the Battle of Kasserine Pass. There, German forces launched a powerful counterattack against American positions in the mountainous terrain of western Tunisia. The assault exposed deficiencies in American defensive planning and battlefield coordination. Units were overwhelmed, and several positions collapsed under pressure. Kasserine was a shock. Hundreds of American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment was abandoned. For many young troops, it was a brutal awakening to the realities of modern warfare against a highly capable enemy. Yet the defeat was not catastrophic. It was instructive. American commanders moved swiftly to reorganize. Leadership changes were implemented. General Dwight D. Eisenhower strengthened coordination among Allied forces. General George S. Patton was given command of the U.S. the Second Corps, bringing a new level of discipline and aggressiveness. Training intensified even while combat operations continued. The lessons of Kasserine reshaped the American Army. Communication improved. Combined arms tactics became more integrated. Air-ground coordination strengthened under the guidance of innovative commanders who recognized the importance of close air support. In many ways, Tunisia became the crucible in which the modern American fighting force was forged. Allied momentum builds while American forces regrouped. British units under General Bernard Montgomery advanced from the east after their victory at El Alamein. Axis forces found themselves squeezed between two converging Allied armies. The Allied strategy was now clear: trap and eliminate Axis troops in Tunisia before they could retreat to Europe. Air superiority played a decisive role. Allied aircraft targeted supply routes, ports, and airfields, gradually isolating German and Italian units. By the spring of 1943, the balance had shifted. Allied forces launched coordinated offensives from multiple directions. Town after town fell. Axis troops, cut off from adequate reinforcement and resupply, began to run short of fuel and ammunition. In May 1943, the campaign reached its climax. Surrounded and outnumbered, approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. It was one of the largest Axis capitulations of the war, comparable in scale to the German defeat at Stalingrad earlier that year. A victory in North Africa marked the end of Axis presence on the continent. Strategic Consequences Operation Torch and the broader North African campaign achieved far more than territorial gains. Strategically, the Allies secured control of the Mediterranean southern coast. Shipping lanes became safer. The Suez Canal was no longer under imminent threat. Politically, the campaign reshaped alliances. French forces in North Africa gradually aligned with the Allies, contributing troops to subsequent operations. The uneasy relationship with Vichy authorities gave way to a more unified French resistance effort. For the United States, North Africa provided invaluable combat experience. Soldiers who had faced defeat and adapted emerged more seasoned and confident. Commanders who demonstrated skill under pressure gained prominence. The success also paved the way for the next phase of Allied strategy: the invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and the subsequent campaign in Italy. By opening the Mediterranean front, Operation Torch set in motion a chain of events that would draw Axis resources away from other theaters and gradually tighten the noose around Nazi Germany. A turning point in Allied cooperation beyond battlefield outcomes, Operation Torch strengthened Anglo-American cooperation. Joint planning, shared command structures, and combined logistics laid the groundwork for even larger operations. Trust between British and American leadership deepened through shared hardship. The experience also highlighted the complexity of coalition warfare. Differences in equipment, communication systems, and military culture required constant negotiation. Yet these challenges ultimately produced a more cohesive alliance. Torch demonstrated that large-scale amphibious invasions were possible with proper coordination. The lessons learned in North Africa would later inform the planning of Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings in Normandy. The human dimension amid strategy and logistics, the human cost remained ever present. Young soldiers from farms, cities, and small towns across America found themselves fighting in deserts and mountains thousands of miles from home. Many experienced combat for the first time in Tunisia's rocky passes and sun-scorched plains. Letters home described confusion, fear, and determination. Medical units worked tirelessly under fire. Engineers repaired roads and bridges under threat of attack. Naval crews endured submarine risks while transporting reinforcements. The campaign was not glamorous. It was dusty, grueling, and often chaotic. But it transformed the American military from an untested force into a battle-hardened army capable of sustained operations against Germany. By mid-1943, Operation Torch had achieved its primary objectives. North Africa was secure. The Axis had suffered a significant strategic setback, and the United States had proven its commitment to the European war effort. Yet Torch was only the beginning. The Mediterranean would soon become a stepping stone to mainland Europe, and the lessons learned in North Africa about leadership, logistics, air power, and coalition warfare would shape the remainder of the war. America had entered the European battlefield through the sands of North Africa. The experience would echo all the way to the beaches of Normandy. When Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered in May 1943, the guns across North Africa fell silent. But the significance of Operation Torch extended far beyond the desert battlefield. It was not merely a regional victory. It was a strategic transformation. For the first time in the Second World War, American ground forces had engaged and defeated German troops in sustained combat. The psychological, military, and political consequences would ripple across the remainder of the conflict. Opening the Mediterranean door with North Africa secured, the Mediterranean Sea shifted from contested waters to an Allied highway. Convoys could move more freely between Gibraltar and the Suez Canal. Malta, once besieged and bombed relentlessly, gained breathing space. Supply lines that had been threatened by Axis aircraft and submarines became more secure. Control of North Africa enabled the next decisive step, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. That operation, known as Operation Husky, relied heavily on the infrastructure and experience gained during Torch. Troops who had learned painful lessons in Tunisia now executed amphibious landings with greater precision and coordination. Air-ground cooperation improved dramatically. Logistics chains were better organized. The American army that fought in Sicily was far more confident and capable than the one that had stumbled at Kasserine Pass months earlier. The fall of Sicily triggered political upheaval in Italy. Benito Mussolini was deposed, and Italy eventually surrendered to the Allies. Though Germany swiftly occupied much of the peninsula and fighting continued, the Mediterranean front forced Hitler to divert divisions that might otherwise have strengthened defenses in France or reinforced the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. Thus, Torch indirectly shaped the broader strategic map of Europe. Forging commanders for a global war operation Torch also served as a proving ground for leaders who would define the Allied war effort. General Dwight D. Eisenhower demonstrated his ability to manage multinational forces, balance political sensitivities, and oversee vast logistical operations. His performance in North Africa was instrumental in his later appointment as Supreme Allied Commander for the Normandy invasion. General George S. Patton emerged as a bold and aggressive field commander. Though controversial, His leadership revitalized American forces after early setbacks. Officers who proved effective in North Africa carried their experience into Italy, France, and beyond. Even at lower levels, junior officers and non-commissioned leaders gained invaluable combat knowledge. They learned how to adapt under fire, coordinate armor and infantry, and maintain morale amid uncertainty. These lessons would save lives in later campaigns. North Africa was the classroom in which the United States Army matured. The political dimensions Operation Torch reshaped relationships within the Allied coalition. Cooperation between American and British forces, initially cautious and sometimes tense, grew stronger through shared hardship. Differences in strategy, doctrine, and culture required compromise. But those compromises built mutual respect. The campaign also altered relations with France. Though the initial landings involved clashes with Vichy forces, the eventual alignment of French troops with the Allies strengthened the Free French movement. French units from North Africa would later participate in the liberation of Europe, restoring national pride after years of occupation. Globally, Torch signaled that the United States was fully committed to defeating Nazi Germany. Until then, some observers questioned whether America's primary focus would remain in the Pacific against Japan. The North African landings erased doubt. The United States was now decisively engaged in the European theater. Lessons in modern warfare from a military perspective, Operation Torch provided a blueprint for future amphibious invasions. Coordinating naval bombardment, air support, and troop landings required meticulous timing. Intelligence gathering, deception planning, and supply management proved just as important as battlefield bravery. The Allies refined techniques for transporting massive forces across oceans, landing them on hostile shores, and sustaining them inland. These capabilities would culminate in the Normandy landings in June 1944, where the scale dwarfed Torch but relied heavily on its lessons. Air superiority emerged as a decisive factor. In Tunisia, improved Allied air coordination eventually disrupted Axis supply lines and reinforcements. This experience reinforced the principle that modern warfare demanded integration across land, sea, and air domains. The human story beyond strategy and command charts, Operation Torch was a deeply human experience. Soldiers endured heat, sandstorms, and rugged mountain terrain. Many faced the shock of combat for the first time. Fear and uncertainty mingled with determination. Medical teams worked under primitive conditions. Engineers built airstrips and repaired roads under enemy threat. Sailors guarded convoys against submarines. Pilots flew missions over hostile territory with limited navigation tools. For many Americans, North Africa was their introduction to the scale and brutality of global war. Letters home described unfamiliar landscapes and newfound resolve. Casualty lists, though smaller than those in later European battles, reminded families that the cost of war had become personal. The campaign's hardships forged resilience. Units that struggled early developed cohesion through adversity. Shared sacrifice strengthened bonds that would carry them through Sicily, Italy, and ultimately France and Germany. A symbolic threshold Operation Torch represented a threshold crossed. Before November 1942, America's war in Europe was largely industrial and naval, producing weapons, escorting convoys, and providing support. After Torch, American infantry stood face-to-face with German troops in sustained land combat. The invasion demonstrated that the Allies could mount complex offensive operations across continents. It shifted the war's momentum. Axis forces were no longer advancing relentlessly. They were retreating, defending, and surrendering in large numbers. The psychological impact mattered. For occupied peoples across Europe, the Allied victory in North Africa offered hope that liberation was possible. For Germany and Italy, it marked the beginning of a defensive war they would increasingly struggle to sustain. From Torch to victory, though overshadowed by later, more dramatic operations, Torch was the essential first step in the Allied return to Europe. It bridged the gap between defensive survival and offensive momentum. It tested American readiness, exposed weaknesses, and forced rapid adaptation. Without Torch, there would have been no smooth path to Sicily, no Italian campaign to drain Axis strength, and perhaps no timely preparation for the Normandy invasion. The sands of North Africa were the proving ground upon which larger victories were built. By the time Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in 1944, they were no longer inexperienced newcomers. They were veterans shaped by deserts and mountains, by setbacks and hard-won triumphs. Operation Torch was not the war's final blaze, but it was the flame that illuminated America's path onto the European battlefield.